Ladies and gentlemen, when they say achievement, they have the picture of Ethan Yang next to it. He is a very accomplished young man in terms of his economic studies. In addition to that, he serves as the editorial assistant at the American Institute for Economic Research. He is also committed to the encouragement and as well the enlightenment of young people, and is a volunteer with the Students for Liberty. Uh, I want to introduce to some and present to others none other than Ethan Lang as we talk about the subject matter of uh, lockdowns. We just came off the subject matter of domestic violence. Ethan, I thank you so much for being with us tonight. And there are lots of people who are under the impression that lockdowns are the greatest thing since Swiss cheese, and that, quite frankly, uh, the message that we're hearing from the Joe Biden team is that a 4 to 6 week lockdown would be the just best canoodling thing we can do as a nation. Ethan, is that true?
Hi Ken, it's great to be here. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because for the most part, I don't think the evidence has really shown that lockdowns have worked in any capacity. You know, we were told back in March that we should have a lockdown 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and we tried it. And I don't think anyone would be at all pleased with the results that have resulted from our experiment with these lockdown policies. So the notion that some people in the highest levels of presumably what will be the next administration are considering this as if this is the best thing that's ever happened, like you just mentioned, is really perplexing and a little concerning that we have that some people are actually pleased with what happened. You know, it's like I guess I remember I saw something on the internet one day. It was just a quote, and it was just like, if lockdowns worked the first time, then we wouldn't need them the second time. And if they didn't work, then why are we trying again, right? So this, for me, it's in a lot of people. There's just so much evidence that goes against it, and it's a little concerning that we are considering it with so much enthusiasm.
You know, there are those who are highly touting the idea of mandating masks, which I am not a huge fan of, and I don't know if you are, but masking is a slight thing. Lockdowns are a very severe uh, attempt to mitigate a invisible warrior. Am I correct in this regard? What do the governments mean when they say lockdown?
hmm So obviously, lockdowns could mean a number of things, but what it's mean in the U.S. is first and foremost closing "quote unquote" non-essential and essential businesses, as if we understand which businesses are essential and non-essential. In my opinion, and a lot of opinions of many people, all businesses are essential first and foremost. But there's
Exactly.
also curfew orders, like in my home state of California. The governor just announced that I believe somewhere in December, I think late December, you know, you won't be able to leave your house between the hours of 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. as if for some reason the virus tends to come out after the hours of 10 p.m. and goes to sleep during 5, you know, stuff like that. And also, like obviously, there's various states would have their own policies when it comes to leaving your house. You can get fined. Some states, I believe, have mask mandates now, like all sorts of various policies that intrude on your individual privacy as well as your right to assemble, your right to earn a living, just completely upending everything that it means to live in a free society and everything that's actually worked. You know, this is, I'm not just saying it because I like freedom. I'm saying it because scientifically, this is how you build a prosperous and well-functioning society that can deal with pandemics. It can also just take care of its own citizens on a day-to-day business,
Well,
day-to-day. Yeah, go ahead.
as an economic researcher, I would pretend that you would say that. Apparently, you don't care about human lives. You don't care about infection. You don't care that people are dying. Your retort to that, sir?
Of course, and that's obviously a retort that's been given about a lot. But if you look at the evidence, you know, if you look at the states that locked down the hardest, like New York, California, Massachusetts, um, not only are COVID deaths going up, but at the same time, these lockdown policies, when you put this much stress on people's lives, suicides go up, substance abuse goes up, depression goes up, domestic violence goes up. When people cannot go to work and they can't live the lives that they were used to, it's like basically pulling out the foundation of our entire society. And that itself leads to a lot of adverse consequences, one of which is death. But if we're really going to talk about how do we support the healthcare sector the most, lockdowns for the most part, especially in this is one example I highlight in some of my work in Michigan.
Yes.
A lot of surgical procedures were deemed quote unquote unessential. I don't know whose idea was that, but apparently a lot of essential medical procedures were deemed quote unquote non-essential by the regulators, which obviously led to a lot of people missing their surgeries, which we can all know how terrible that must be. So for the most part, I don't think, first and foremost, the lockdowns have not produced their guaranteed effect of mitigating COVID-19, preventing death, preventing new cases. And on top of all that, they've produced a whole slew of adverse side effects that have exacerbated the consequences of this pandemic.
Ethan, there have been those who would, on the other side of the fence, say that you are not aware, as an economist, of the great successes of China and India and other nations that have locked down, including France and the European nations that have locked down. Have those nations truly been successful? Can we trust the data that is received through the World Health Organization from those particular countries?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's really, if you just Google it right now, deaths per capita, countries like Belgium and the United Kingdom actually have higher deaths per capita than the US. So they're actually doing worse, and their lockdowns have been as strict, if not stricter. Other countries such as France, other countries in Europe, um, if they have lower deaths per capita, it's not by a lot, right? They're still
Yes.
leading top, I forgot like what top percentile, but and then also China. I think China is obviously a very silly example because I think every single day under authoritarian Chinese regime is not preferable by any stretch of the imagination. So even though this is also another topic that I'm really into is not only do I study economics, but I like to study political science and law. So even though let's say we trust China, right? Obviously, I don't think that's a very good idea, but let's pretend, they're not lying and they solved their pandemic really quickly. Well, yeah, but if you look at videos, there's literally SWAT cars pulling up and pulling random people off the street, like just like SWAT team style, like that. In order to live in that sort of system, you can't just that it doesn't magically just go away, right? Once like the Chinese government's not going to say, "Oh, COVID's gone, so now we're going to become a liberal democracy tomorrow," right? And obviously, like that's a ridiculous example. If you look at what happens in the U.S., if let's for example, if we decide to throw away our constitution and allow
Yeah.
our governments to exert this much power, they're not going to say the next day, okay, COVID's gone, I would like to become George Washington and release all my powers and grant everybody liberty and equality under the law. No, no. For the most part, when the government creates a program, there's inertia to it. It stays, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't go away. Have Americans gotten freer or less free since the development of the progressive movement under Woodrow Wilson, FDR? Probably less free. The state continues to grow. All these social programs and expansive government continues to grow. So this is like right now. I think it's an existential moment where we are teetering on the precipice of giving away so much more power to the government than we've actually that's completely unprecedented. And if we don't stop it, then it's going to keep going, right? This is not like
Exactly.
doomsday preaching. This is basic political science.
No, it's political science 101. It's one of the first things that you learn about freedom and liberty is that the state is there to protect it. But once you give your powers over to the state, they're not giving back. They're just not. Even there are those who are watching tonight, and I want to go into three different areas over the course of our conversation. One being uh, the whole idea of education, which I'll broach on at this point. I want to talk with you about the economic situation of our country in comparison to the rest of the world. And then lastly, I want to talk with you about the whole idea of law and whether the Constitution has been perverted as never before. I believe Justice Alito made that assertion earlier last week, this week, forgive me. But in the first area of education, you work with students as part of a volunteer organization. You understand how vital education is. How detrimental is it to, because online learning is not the same thing as homeschooling, two different things. For the states across the country, District of Columbia as well, to confine students to online learning uh, for over almost a year now. How detrimental is that?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely an essential question. And obviously, I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't work
Yeah,
in the education sector, but I do read the reports. I do study it kind of from a macro perspective. And for the most part, we are seeing just absolute devastation across the education sector. For the most part, like I completed the end of my college degree on Zoom, and it was not a pleasant experience. And this is,
yeah,
I went to like a pretty fancy school. You know, I had some pretty top-notch professors. We're talking of, and like, you know, that's me, but we're talking about students, you know, probably in an public school in a really devastated area of the country. You know, I don't think those students are probably getting the same education that I'm getting. And
yeah,
yeah, we've seen a whole generation of students of all age groups robbed of essential educational opportunities. And I remember one of my colleagues is actually, she was homeschooled, and she wrote an article talking about how this is not an experiment in homeschooling, right?
exactly.
Homeschooling is a very explicit and very methodical, well thought out process of education, right? Ending school
Exactly.
abruptly and throwing everybody back in their houses and telling them to use Zoom is not homeschooling. And I don't think you need to be, and like you have to have a PhD in education to understand that that is not a good idea.
The teachers' unions in this regard say that it is not as safe to be in the classroom as a Walmart worker working on the floor of the store itself. Apparently, being around children who normally do not get the virus, and if they do, they're very quick in terms of releasing themselves of the virus. 99.99% recovery rate. Uh, is the power of the teachers union detrimental, and is there a sense of a malign in all of this as a result of politics rather than natural science?
Yeah, and I think one of the first things that must put out is that nobody really understands the virus yet. We've seen so many different studies saying so many different things over the course of the past 9 or so months. So the notion that the teachers unions, for some reason, have it all figured out and they have the best policy prescription, I think, should be taken with some skepticism, right? Obviously, we should
Yeah,
care about our teachers, especially the older ones. The elderly people are the most disadvantaged when it comes to the disease. But when it comes to completely throwing away our duties to our children, to educate our children, educate the next generation, and stopping school should probably be at the bottom of the priority list, right? There should
hmm,
be some sort of scale where we start from complete normalcy and then potentially move towards um, ending, like sending kids back at the very, very last resort, right? But for the most
yeah,
part, if you look at some literature, most of the literature actually says that if we're going to end in-person schooling, it should be at the very beginning of a pandemic, mostly in response to build hospital capacity. It's not to protect everybody and stop the virus in its tracks. For the most part, that's not really seen any historical precedent. It hasn't really been tried or proven to work in history.
Ethan, with us tonight, ladies and gentlemen, from the American Institute of Economic Research. In terms of this particular virus and closing on education, in exchange for the security of knowing that the government is trying to protect us, what do we lose in the sense of economics for a nearly year and a half? Because they're next year they will continue with this process probably until September. Um, More than a year of our children not being in a formal educational setting. How detrimental is that to our economy?
I think that's definitely a great question. That's certainly the effects are yet to be seen because if you just look at what happened to our economy before we closed the schools, right? Before, if you're just looking at business closures and what that's done, it's been absolutely detrimental. We've probably seen the biggest retraction of the American economy in modern history, right?
Hmm.
So the business closures alone were extremely devastating. But now we're going to be looking at a generation of children who lost out on an educational opportunity for about a year. And I don't like I can't really tell you because I don't think we've ever done this before, right?
Yeah,
Who knows what an entire year's loss of education is going to do, not only for the economy but for our social fabric. I think that's another thing people don't talk about. Like it's always like COVID-19 or the economy, this and that. It's back and forth, but also just where are we as a society after we've done something like this to ourselves? I obviously, I'm too young to remember any sort of event that can remind me of this. I think
yeah,
most of us don't even understand, like, can't really fathom what we've done to ourselves. It's something out of like an authoritarian country, not the United States of America or most liberal democracies. So, unfortunately, I don't necessarily have an answer besides that. For the most part, I think it's going to be unprecedented. It's probably going to be very damaging, and the effects will be seen when we see them. I can't really make a prediction, and I'm a little, I am concerned, I guess, to say the least.
exactly. You don't catch up. See, this is the point I want to make. As you have had a high level of individual uh, education, um, for the individual who's going to Baltimore, where they have no school that has uh, sustained equitability in terms of either math or English on a national level, those individuals don't catch up. Am I right about that?
Hmm. Yeah, that's totally correct. And I remember when I actually wrote about school closures during the summer, and I cited I think it's the CEO of Baltimore Public Schools, where she not only noted, like, obviously what you just said, these kids are going to lose out on, like, they're already lacking educational opportunities. Now you're just going to make it worse. But at the same time, just from a physical safety perspective, a lot of times schools are where a lot of parents expect their kids to be so they can go about their day, right?
Yeah.
It almost functions as a form of daycare. Like if it's like obviously
Yeah.
that's not it's not very thrilling sense of what the American education system is, but that's how we've lived with it. We've planned our entire civilization on the notion that most our kids will be in school so we can go to work. But if they're especially in an area like Baltimore or other areas where there's lots of violence and drugs and just desperation in general, the schools are what keep the kids away from all sorts of bad stuff. This is what the CEO of Baltimore Public Schools said. And I've never been to Baltimore except once or twice, but I can assume that's, it's probably a good thing to keep your kids, if you're in a not so good area, in a school where they can be watched over and cared for, rather than kind of roaming the streets, maybe getting into gangs or looking into drugs or something like that.
Exactly. And we can see that with the high level of murders and homicides ever increasing as a result of the irresponsible thing that our government has done by shutting down the schools. I want to switch to economics because when you keep kids home, that means that you keep parents home. And normally, these parents that I refer to are low income uh, families, normally one breadwinner. They don't have the luxury of having in home mentoring and tutoring for their children. They're struggling day to day. Uh, in terms of that particular family, what are the possible scarcity lacks that they will face?
I think obviously it's going to differ from family to family, but I can only imagine how terrifying and how devastating that must be. We have the stimulus check program, but that's only so much money, and obviously there's nothing like having an actual paycheck that you can bring in money on a consistent basis. But for the most part, this is a serious problem. When you have kids forced to stay home, then the parents also must stay home. And kind of pivoting back to the healthcare sector point, if we're so because we are so concerned about preventing death,
Mm-hmm.
there's been multiple studies have shown that the healthcare sector is disproportionately vulnerable to such a policy because a lot of healthcare workers, apparently more so than most other people, have kids they need to take care of. So
Mm-hmm.
one study I referenced says that if we close the schools, we will see about a around a 15% or more or less. We don't know for sure, but it's a double digit percentage drop in the amount of healthcare workers that are available to report to work if we close the schools. Imagine what a 15% drop in nurses and paramedics and surgeons and doctors and what
Wow.
have you, right? And that, like, we need all hands on deck to fight the virus. Our hospitals, like, for the most part now we're kind of like in a calm period, but like when the virus heats up, our hospitals get overwhelmed and that's when people die. We need our healthcare professionals on the front lines. And if you force kids back to go back out of schools and go and into homes, we're going to lose some healthcare workers to take care of their kids, right? So if we
Exactly.
want to so that's the most scary thing for me, is that we don't know what is this going to do, other than it will be very, very disruptive.
Ethan, it's getting colder in America as a result of winter season, and the restaurant industry, which um, prophesies that 60% of the restaurants in America would shut down this winter if uh, they can't stay open and have indoor accessibility. Got to ask you here, what is that impact on the economy with employment, with contracting, with transportation? What are some of the things that will suffer as a result of these particular restaurants closing?
I think that's definitely a great question. And the answer, again, is similar to one of my previous responses, where we don't really know the extent of the damage that will happen. Because, like I said, there's no such thing as an essential or non-essential business. If the politicians say that we're going to shut down, these kinds of restaurants, and it's only going to affect these kinds of businesses, that's complete. Like, no one knows, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be shockwaves that fly all throughout the economy. Like, who benefits from restaurants staying open? Probably farmers, who grow the food to send to them. Who do the farmers benefit? Probably people who sell the farm equipment. Like, it goes on and on and on and on, and that's how the economy works. Which is why a lot of economists, such as myself, as well as my as well as my colleagues, get so irritated when politicians like to prescribe these solutions, because nobody knows how the economy works in that fashion. You can't tailor these shutdowns because the economy is so interconnected, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
remember one of my colleagues, he said, like, I like to quote, like, the epidemiologists, the people who make these predictions of how the virus moves and how to stop it,
Yeah.
are learning the same lesson that the economists had to learn in the 20th century. What happened in the 20th century? That was the rise of socialism. That was the rise of Keynesianism, big government
Yep.
intervention, expansionary monetary policy. And the economists, we learned the hard way that you can't be that specific, right? You can't intervene that hard and get the results you want. So that's why a lot of economists have, swayed away from that. The epidemiologists are slowly learning that lesson today, right? They think
Mm-hmm.
that, oh, we know everything there is to know about this virus. We have all the solutions, and it's totally going to work. No, like, they're learning this exact same thing. Things are way too complicated, especially from 1,000 miles away, right? Solutions are
Exactly.
probably best given towards those closest to the issue. Community-based solutions, not solutions litigated from the top down 1,000 miles away.
The stock market has already priced in the fact that there will not be a stimulus until sometime after February, if it's essential, if it's necessary. Yet, how does that impact the modern consumer, the man and woman at home that's been struggling and were promised $1,200 or thereabouts and didn't receive it? What is their impact?
I think their families will be absolutely devastated. I forgot what the exact percentage was, but I remember Yelp, or it was either Yelp or Eater, one of those big
Mm-hmm.
food service companies, and they put out a number that I think it was close to like 40% or even more of restaurants will not open again, right? We
Wow.
closed a bunch of restaurants close to half. I forgot the exact number, but it was double digits, pretty high. They're not coming back, right?
Yeah.
Which, if you, like, let's put yourself in, like, let's say you're an immigrant like my family who comes
Mm-hmm.
over from Asia, like, puts everything they have into some small business to open up here in America because this is where
Exactly.
it's at, right? This is where you can start your business. And all of a sudden the government just comes along and crushes it. What are you going to do? Right? 10,000 miles away from home. You probably have some language issues. You probably don't have a good network. Like I don't even know what to do in that point. Like obviously I'm lucky enough for my family, as well as myself are established enough where that won't really hurt us. But
Yes.
there's 330 million people in this country. A few million of them are the people I just described,
Yes.
right? So I don't know what to say. It's just the most. I think it's just a disgrace what we're going to do to some people.
Exactly. And I know that you have studied law. I know that you have studied economics and politics. But what course have you taken that basically stated that the governor of a state knows best what to do in a pandemic? Have you had that class yet?
No, I don't think that's definitely in the curriculum. But at the rate things are going, maybe it might be.
Yeah.
When Comrade Newsom, puts that in the curriculum.
Now, in levity, but going to a more serious issue, liberty and freedom. Justice Alito stated that the actions of the governors in states regarding the First Amendment, the free practice of religion, is a very darkening sign into America as to the uh, veracity of the Constitution. I want to ask you at this particular point, should Americans who have traded their security uh, for protection worry about the state taking away those basic freedoms? Or am I exaggerating and this is all hyperbole?
I definitely think we should be very concerned about the future of our freedoms, especially in today's day and age. I think the Constitution has probably been more trodden upon in the past few decades than it has been in any other point in history. Obviously, we have some like things like slavery, things Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's obviously terrible mishaps, but today, especially today, I don't see a bigger threat to our constitutional liberties than what is going on today. The slow unraveling and sometimes the consensual unraveling, so not like obviously not a majority of the population, but enough people, are just crying to have their rights taken away so that they can have some sense of security. And I think that's a very, very unsustainable policy, right? Because the
No.
government never gives back your security,
No.
your rights, unless you forcefully take it back with litigation or something like that, right?
Now, that is a question I have for you because it appears, in terms of litigants, that we're losing that fight even in the courts. So the provocation to the common man is if I can't win in the courts, if I can't keep my business alive, and all of these things are happening because the government is forcing its hand upon me. It's not the invisible hand, it's a very visible fist. Shouldn't I be provoked? And is there a risk of rebellion in this country?
I definitely think that's the worst case scenario. And as we are seeing across the country, we're already seeing anti-lockdown protests, not just in this country, but countries across the world.
Yeah.
And it's not you don't really need a degree in poli sci to tell someone that if you do this to them, if you lock down and destroy their lives, people are going to get very upset. And we've already seen a terrorist attempt against the governor of Michigan, which I completely do not endorse and I believe is obviously very rash and irresponsible. But
Yes.
that's what happens when you have a country of 330 million people and you take their freedom away like this, right?
Yes.
So obviously, the court system, the litigation system, is probably you have, and I think in the United States more than anywhere else in the world, you have the best chance of beating the government in its courts. But
Yes.
if you cannot do that, if that does not happen, and people continue to be upset, then we may see some very adverse and violent consequences, which I would be afraid to see happen.
Ethan Yang with us tonight. Final question for you, Ethan. The presidency in its election has not been confirmed just yet. Right now, Donald Trump is at 232 and Joe Biden at 227 regarding the Electoral College, according to Epic Times. Uh, I got to ask you here. One says lockdowns, the other says no lockdowns. Which one of them is following the science?
I definitely think that, at least in my personal opinion, that the science says that lockdowns are not a good policy. And I don't like, not only is it just the science that says it's not a good policy, but it's the economics, it's the general moral decency that also says it's not a good policy, and it's the basic political science that says that if you mess with society in this fashion, it probably will not come back to where it was. It will probably be
Mm-hmm.
a very much degraded shell of itself, right? And I don't think anyone has ever done this much damage to a society, and it just comes springing back and forth like it's like never happened, right?
Yeah.
So I think that this is why so many scientists prior to, like, if you look, I think everyone needs to look up Donald Henderson. Dr. Donald Henderson passed away in 2016. He led the WHO's eradication of smallpox, right? So this guy's a legend. And
Yeah.
he published a paper in 2006 that literally talks about every single policy that has been enacted in this pandemic. Like, this guy was Nostradamus or something, right? This guy had psychic powers. Like, he talks about lockdowns, he talks about social distancing, he talks about school closure, he talks about masks, he talks about vaccination. And he basically says everything that I just said, right? I didn't make this all up. Like, I understand that I don't have a background in medicine, so I read an actual doctor's stuff, right? A
Yeah.
respected doctor who eradicated smallpox, as well as, a lot of other doctors and white papers and whatnot. It's what I get paid to do, right?
Yeah.
But he said that all the way back in 2006, that considering a lockdown policy is not only based in absolutely no historical evidence, like it has never happened, but if you just think about it for a little bit, use your logic, it's not going to work. And this is way back in 2006. And this has been the stance of the WHO for decades. The WHO, if you looked at its policies, prior to the outbreak, it said that we shouldn't lock down. A couple of months in, it said we shouldn't lock down. Then it says we should totally lock down. And then a couple months later, it says we shouldn't lock down. Lockdowns are a bad idea.
Yeah.
So I'm going to assume that means lockdowns are a bad idea, right? That's
Thank you.
just a hunch.
Thank you. If you're not China, a lockdown is a very bad thing. And by the way, in the Chinese communities, they were nailing the door shut. So if America is ready for that, I'm not. I'm not at all. Ethan Yang with us tonight, ladies and gentlemen, editorial assistant at the American Institute for Economic Research. Thank you so much for being with us and giving us the great illuminating information regarding lockdowns. They just don't work. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
We look forward to your return. We're going to need you over the next few weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan Yang. Listen, we got to take a quick break. When we go to break, ladies and gentlemen, when I come back, I want to talk with you about the murder of the young man as a result of domestic violence and why the contributor, the silent contributor to that, may actually be your state that says it cares for your very life.